I would like to now direct your attention to a few examples in archaeology demonstrating how we can interpret the archaeological record in a way to give us a better understanding of the symbolic and ideological beliefs of people in the distant past. The first example is with regard to the temple period of the Maltese Islands. The temple period is generally associated with the late Neolithic for the islands of Malta. During this period, the ancient Maltese had a form of self imposed isolation, it is believed. And by essentially cutting themselves off from the rest of the central Mediterranean world, by not being actively engaged in the different trade networks that were taking place at the time, they essentially became focused upon themselves, and this inward focus essentially encouraged them to develop a unique culture that isn't found anywhere else throughout the Mediterranean. Specifically, they focused on megalithic construction. Above ground, they built megalithic temples, and below ground, they built or they carved into the limestone of the islands these subterranean chambers that served as communal burial spaces. Depicted in this slide currently in front of you is the Hypogeum of Helcephiani. It is one of these subterranean tombs that was carved in the limestone in the island of Malta. As you can see in the picture, there appears to be different niches as well as entrances to other rooms within the structure. Archaeologists have discovered within several of these niches and rooms the remains of humans in a very interesting condition. Essentially, the ancient Maltese did not bury their dead in individual graves, but essentially collected the bones of all their dead ancestors and buried them together in a pile, essentially, within each of these rooms and niches. It is believed that uh, that after a period, basically after a period when the body was fully decomposed, the ancient people collected the bones and added them to the different piles within the subterranean chambers. There's also some indication that these piles were moved around within the chambers over time. This raises some interesting questions. Why did they do this? What did this symbolically represent to the ancient Maltese during the Temple period? What does it tell us about their belief in the afterlife, their spiritual beliefs, their ideology, the way they viewed themselves, their own identity, essentially? One potential interpretation centers around the possibility that this meant that individual identity was not important to the Maltese people, but being part of a larger group was. Therefore, instead of looking at their ancestors as individuals, they saw it as essentially as a collective soul, a singularity, if you will. The bones being interchangeable as one of many of the ancestors with whom they generally identified with as a group of people. And this may suggest that politically their society was had a very collective nature. Over time, we do see changes in the archaeological record. Specifically, when we get into the early Bronze Age, we see a shift in the way human remains were treated. In particular, we see during the early Bronze Age, which is known as the Targine Cemetery phase in Malta, two new practices. One centered around the cremation of their dead, and the other individual graves that would indicate that there may potentially been a shift in either the population's worldview or ideological beliefs or religious beliefs that have taken place over time. And there could be many reasons why this shift took place. It is possible that changes in the environment brought about different reasons for them to adapt culturally to those specific changes, specifically dealing with limited resources that might have been taking place in the island landscape that altered the way they viewed their world, the way they and through that they adapted their beliefs in different ways. It could represent a migration of people that came into Malta that influenced the belief system of the people that were originally there. There could be a number of explanations as to why we see this shift from these communal graves to these individual graves and cremation practices in the early Bronze Age. A second example is looking at a series of specific artifacts, stone tools. And these stone tools depicted in this slide are made by Neanderthals. And what's interesting about these stone tools, they do show careful attention to detail, and we can see patterns within the stone tools that were repeated over time. Basically, within the different various stratigraphic layers, we could see the same processes being used to create these stone tools, and also some adaptation as well over time, improving how the tools are being made. This has allowed some archaeologists to interpret the general mind of the Neanderthal and saying that this may indicate they had a potential use of language, because language would have been the mechanism in which they were able to share how to make these stone tools to future generations. Therefore, each of these stone tools represents a collection of ideas that were being thought of and communicated over time. And these ideas essentially can be charted and compared over time within the archaeological record. And from that, we can see how thinking progressed from one stratigraphic layer to the other in order to gauge the changes in culture or the changes in behavioral practices that took place. Everyone knows the example of Stonehenge. It is one of the most recognized archaeological sites in the world. Stonehenge has been intensively researched, and its meaning and purpose is still highly debated. Various different approaches have been used to try to interpret its symbolic meaning. Some of these interpretations include Stonehenge being essentially a calendar in stone that helped the people of its time determine when to plant and harvest crops, to being a sort of celestial calendar marking out lunar and solar eclipses, to being a device marking key times in the year for certain ritual practices dedicated to the winter and summer solstices, and potentially involving the preparation of their dead for the afterlife. And even today, we still find additional evidence within the archaeological record to help give us context in refining what Stonehenge might have served as for the ancient people who built it, both both in terms of its function as well as its symbolic meaning. But what's important here, again, is having an understanding of its context. And its context is not just the artifacts that are found within the stone circle, but also how the stone circle is positioned within the landscape, where it's located in reference to other stone circles found within the area, and its potential alignment to other structures within the environment or within the stars uh, in the sky.